The moment Mamie Leland realized she had been invisible her entire life was the same moment Warren Mercer looked straight at her and asked a question nobody had ever bothered to ask before. She was standing in the middle of the Mercer ranch yard, her carpetbag at her feet, her dress so thin with washing that the afternoon sun nearly shone through it, and she had just been told, in flat and certain terms, by the ranch foreman Luther Briggs, that the housekeeping position she had ridden 40 miles to fill had already been given to someone else. 3 weeks she had saved for the stage fare. 3 weeks she had starved herself down to 1 meal a day at the boarding house in Laramie, drinking watery coffee and telling herself that something had to change, something had to break open because she could not go on the way she had been going. Invisible, unwanted, passed over at every turn. Luther Briggs had not even looked at her when he told her. He had been watching 2 ranch hands mend a fence line on the far side of the yard, and he spoke to her the way a man speaks to something inconvenient standing in his path. "The position is filled," he said. "You should have confirmed before you came." The injustice of it burned through Mamie like a brand. She had written a letter. She had received no reply, but she had written a letter, and she had come anyway because she was 24 years old and she had been trying to make something of herself for 6 years without a single person offering her a real chance. She had cooked in boarding houses and cleaned in hotels and mended clothes in back rooms, and every single employer had taken exactly what she gave and asked nothing more of her, because asking more of her would have required them to see her, and nobody saw Mamie Leland. She picked up her carpetbag. She would not cry. She had decided years ago that crying was a luxury she could not afford, because once she started she was not at all confident she could stop. It was then that the door of the main house opened, and Warren Mercer stepped out onto the porch. She knew who he was the moment she saw him, the owner of the Double M Ranch. The man who had, over 12 years of grueling, unrelenting work, turned 500 acres of raw Wyoming Territory into one of the most productive cattle operations in the county. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone slightly too long, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. His eyes, when they settled on her, were the color of creek water in October, that particular gray-green that carries within it the memory of warmer seasons. He had clearly been inside long enough to hear none of what Luther had told her because his expression was simply curious, not dismissive, not absent, curious. "What are you good at?" he asked. Mamie stood very still. In 24 years, living under the roof of a father who considered daughters an inconvenience, working for employers who considered her a pair of hands attached to a mostly irrelevant body, no one had ever once asked her that question. What are you good at? Not what can you do, which was a question about her usefulness. Not what have you done, which was a question about her past. What are you good at, which was a question that assumed she was good at something, which assumed she had abilities worth naming, which assumed she was a person worth the asking. She looked at Warren Mercer for a long moment, and the honest answer rose up in her with an urgency that surprised her. "Numbers," she said. "I am very good with numbers, and I can read and write better than most men I have met. I can keep books, run a ledger, track inventory, draft letters. I can do those things, and I can do them well." Warren studied her. Then he said, "Luther, you ran off the woman I hired to replace Harris." Luther turned from the fence line. Warren looked at Mamie. "I have a bookkeeper who developed a fondness for whiskey and disappeared 6 weeks ago with $200 of my operating money. What I need is not a housekeeper. What I need is someone who can tell me where every cent on this ranch has gone and help me make sure it never happens again." He paused. "Are you willing to try?" Mamie said yes before she had finished understanding the full weight of what she was agreeing to. She had not known, standing there in that ranch yard with her carpetbag in the dust, that she had just walked into the most complicated, most dangerous, most ultimately transformative circumstance of her life. She had not known that the ledger books of the Double M held secrets that stretched back years. She had not known that there were men in Laramie who would rather see Warren Mercer ruined than allow him to uncover what was hidden inside those numbers. She had not known any of that. She had only known that for the first time in her life, someone had asked her what she was good at, and she had told the truth. Mamie had been born in 1862, the second of 4 children in a tenant farming family in eastern Kansas. Her father, a lean and humorless man named Gerald Leland, had worked the same exhausted piece of rented land his entire adult life and expected the same exhausted cycle of effort from everyone around him. Her mother, Ruth, had been pretty once and had traded it early for survival. There had never been money enough for schooling, but their nearest neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Forsyth, had taught Mamie to read when she was 7 and then, discovering something unusual in the child, had lent her books from a collection that was remarkable for the frontier. Mamie had read everything: mathematics textbooks, agricultural journals, merchant accounting guides. She had devoured them all with a hunger her family had never thought to notice, because in their world, a girl who read books was either showing off or wasting time, and either way it was not useful. When Mamie was 18, her father had arranged a marriage to a farmer 2 counties over named Dale Prout. Dale was not unkind. He was simply not interested in Mamie as anything more than another pair of hands. He had wanted children and a clean house and meals on the table, and Mamie had provided all 3. But inside the 3 years of their marriage, she had felt herself growing smaller and smaller, contracting inward until she was not sure there was anything left of the girl who had stayed up by candlelight reading merchant accounting guides. Dale died in the winter of 1883, taken by pneumonia in January when the Kansas cold came down like a punishment. He left Mamie a small amount of debt and a freedom she had not expected and did not know at first what to do with. She was 21 years old and suddenly entirely responsible for herself, which was terrifying and secretly, guiltily, something that felt like possibility. She spent the next 3 years moving. Kansas, then Nebraska, then Wyoming Territory as the frontier jobs shifted and the wages shifted with them. She cooked and cleaned and mended and did every job a woman without connections could get, and she saved what little she could, and she read every newspaper she could get her hands on, and she quietly, in the back rooms of various boarding houses, kept the books for establishments whose owners barely knew she was doing it because she had offered to do it quietly in exchange for a slight reduction in her room fees. She was good at it. She was spectacularly good at it in a way that the world had never once confirmed, because the world had never once looked, until Warren Mercer asked. The room she was given at the Double M was a small but clean space off the back of the main house, used previously as storage. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the south pasture, and a small iron stove that Luther Briggs had installed with conspicuous resentment, making it clear with every bang of the pipe fitting that he considered Mamie Leland's presence a problem he was not fully prepared to accommodate. Mamie had seen resentment before. She set up her things with quiet efficiency and went to find the ledger books. They were in a study off the main hall, a room that smelled of leather and old paper and the ghost of tobacco smoke. There were 4 ledger books on the desk, covering the years 1880 through 1884, and beside them a stack of receipts and invoices in no discernible order. Mamie sat down, tied her hair back, and began. Warren brought her coffee at 7 in the evening without being asked and set it beside her without speaking. She did not look up. He came back at 9 and looked over her shoulder at the notes she was making on a fresh sheet of paper. "What are you seeing?" he asked. She tapped the ledger with her pencil. "Your operating costs in 1882 were consistent and reasonable. In 1883 they begin to drift. Small amounts at first, $5 here, $10 there. By the end of 1883, there is a systematic pattern of small withdrawals made under the category of incidental supply costs that, when I add them together, come to just over $400. She paused. Your former bookkeeper, Harris, you said he disappeared with $200 of operating money. I think the number may be significantly larger than that. Warren was quiet for a moment. How much larger? I need another day with these books to be certain. But my first estimate is close to $900 over 18 months. The silence in the room was dense and particular. She could feel him processing it, feel the shift from surprise to something colder and more deliberate. How, he said, small false entries, inflated supply costs, purchases recorded that I cannot find corresponding receipts for. Your ranch is large enough that individual small errors would be easy to overlook if no one was looking for them. She looked up at him then, because what she was about to say required his full attention. Whoever helped him do this from the outside knew your operation well. The false entries are not random. They target line items that a ranch this size would genuinely spend money on and in amounts that would not individually raise suspicion. This was not opportunistic, Mr. Mercer. It was planned. Warren's jaw tightened. It was the first time she had seen anything beneath the surface of his composure, and it was, she noted with a completely inappropriate spike of awareness, not frightening. It was the look of a man who was angry but controlled, whose anger made him more focused rather than less. He pulled up the chair on the other side of the desk and sat down and said, "Show me." They worked until 2 in the morning. The story that emerged from the numbers was a careful and infuriating one. Harris, the missing bookkeeper, had been siphoning money from the Double M for the better part of 2 years. But the pattern of the false entries suggested he had not been working alone. The amounts pulled through the supply cost entries were consistently sent, as best Mamie could reconstruct from the receipt stubs she had found, to a single supplier in Laramie, a merchant named Arnold Stokes who dealt in general dry goods and whose prices, Mamie noted, ran about 30% above the town average. That name, she said, Arnold Stokes. Does it mean anything to you? Warren looked at the name on the paper. More than it should. Stokes is connected to a man named Calhoun, Del Calhoun. He has been trying to acquire land in this county for 2 years. He wants water access. The Double M controls the best creek frontage for 30 miles. So if your ranch ran into serious financial difficulty, Mamie said slowly, working it out as she spoke, Calhoun would be positioned to acquire it at a reduced price or force a sale. Warren looked at her steadily. That is exactly what I think. The trap had been elegant and patient and nearly perfect. It had required someone inside the ranch, which was Harris. It had required a cooperative merchant in town, which was Stokes. And it had required someone who knew Warren Mercer's ranch well enough to know which supply categories to target. That last piece pointed toward someone with deeper access than a bookkeeper. Mamie did not say that part yet. She filed it away. She slept 4 hours and was back at the desk by 6 in the morning with a fresh pot of coffee that she made herself, having discovered that the ranch cook, a stout and philosophical man named George Hatch, was agreeable to her using the kitchen as long as she left it the way she found it, and did not ask him questions before he had his first cup of the morning. Luther Briggs found her in the study at 7 and stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has decided something is wrong but has not yet identified exactly what. "You should know," he said, "that Mr. Mercer does not generally allow people access to his private books." "He allowed me access," Mamie said without looking up. "You have been here one day. He hired me to do a job, Mr. Briggs. I am doing it." Luther was quiet for a moment. "What are you finding in there?" It was a question that landed with a particular weight, and Mamie set down her pencil and looked at him for a careful moment before answering. "Discrepancies," she said. "Nothing I won't be able to account for in time." It was not a lie. She was simply not going to tell Luther Briggs what she was finding until she understood who Luther Briggs was in relation to the pattern she was uncovering. The supply line entries she was tracking had, in some cases, been authorized with countersignatures. Harris had signed the primary entries. But the authorizations for expenditures over $50 required a second signature. In 7 of the false entries she had identified, the second signature belonged to Luther Briggs. She needed more information before she could determine whether Luther had knowingly participated in the fraud or had been deceived into signing entries he believed were legitimate. She was careful. She was methodical. She did not jump to conclusions because she had learned, in her reading of merchant accounting guides and agricultural business journals, that the most common error in financial investigation was deciding on the answer before the evidence was complete. But she watched Luther Briggs with careful eyes, and she noticed that he was watching her right back. Warren came to the study again that evening with supper on a tray, which he set on the corner of the desk with a slightly self-conscious efficiency that she found, in a distant and professionally suppressed way, endearing. "You do not have to bring me meals," she said. "George said you did not come to the dining room for dinner." He paused. "I should have made clearer that meals are included in your arrangement here." She looked at the tray. There was beef stew and fresh cornbread and a small dish of preserved peaches, and the sight of it after a day of coffee and determined concentration made her realize she was deeply, achingly hungry. "Thank you," she said quietly. He pulled the other chair up and sat down with a directness that was neither presumptuous nor distant, just present, as though sitting in the same room with her while she ate was a natural and unremarkable thing. She ate and told him what she had found during the day, including the countersignatures with Luther's name. He was quiet for a long time after that. "Luther has been with me since I started this ranch," he said finally. "He came out from Missouri the same year I did. He is the reason the first winter cattle drive succeeded." "I understand," Mamie said, "and it may mean nothing. If Harris presented him with paperwork that appeared legitimate and requested his countersignature as a formality, he may have signed without examining the entries carefully. That is the most likely explanation for most of those signatures." She paused. "But there are 2 of them where the false entry is obvious enough that a careful reader would have caught it. Whether Luther read them carefully is something only Luther knows." Warren rubbed a hand over his jaw. The motion was tired and honest, and she felt with a sudden clarity exactly how much this ranch meant to him, not as an asset, as something he had built out of himself, out of his own labor and risk and refusal to give up. The idea that it had been systematically undermined from within was not just a financial injury to him. It was a betrayal. The word landed in her mind with full weight. "I will not tell you what to think about Luther Briggs," she said. "I will tell you what the numbers show, and you can make your own judgment." He looked at her. "That is a more careful thing to say than most people would say. I was not hired to tell you stories," she said. "I was hired to tell you the truth about your books. The 2 are different things." Something shifted in his expression then. Something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it, like the memory of warmth. The next morning Mamie rode into Laramie with Warren, because she had requested to see the town receipts filed with the county ledger that would show what Arnold Stokes had recorded as income from the Double M in 1883, and Warren had arranged access. She had never asked to ride along. He had simply assumed she would, which was a small thing and also not a small thing, because every employer she had ever had assumed she would stay where she was put. Laramie in 1884 was a vigorous and complicated place. It had grown fast out of the railroad's arrival and had not entirely sorted out what kind of town it wanted to be. There were fine buildings going up beside saloons that had been there for 10 years, and the streets were a mixture of enterprise and rawness. Women moved through it in pairs mostly, and the ones who moved alone moved with a purposeful invisibility that Mamie recognized because she had been practicing it for years. The county record's office was a small and efficient room managed by a clerk named Mr. Simmons, who was extremely polite and slightly nervous in Warren Mercer's presence, which told Mamie something about Warren's standing in the county that the ranch itself had already suggested. She spent an hour with the public ledgers and found what she needed. Arnold Stokes had indeed recorded receipts from the Double M in 1883. The amounts matched, within small variations. what Harris's false entries had recorded as sent. But the products listed on Stokes's receipts were not the products listed in Harris's supply entries. Stokes had recorded the money as payment for a completely different category of goods. General merchandise, the receipts read, in amounts and categories vague enough to be essentially meaningless. It was not proof of criminal conspiracy in any formal legal sense, but it was proof that both sides of the transaction had been falsified, which meant that both Harris and Stokes had known they were recording false information. She showed Warren in the hallway of the records building and watched his face go through the particular sequence of a man who has just had confirmed something he was already beginning to dread. "What do you need next?" he asked. She thought about it. "I need to know who Harris is and where he went. If he left Laramie, someone will know the direction. And I need to know more about Del Calhoun. Not gossip, facts, property records, business filings, anything in the public record." He took her to lunch at the town's most respectable restaurant, and the gesture made her briefly and almost imperceptibly uncomfortable, because she was acutely aware of how she looked beside him. He was a man of standing in this county, and she was a woman in a frequently washed dress with a carpetbag and no connections. But the waiter showed no sign of registering any incongruity, and Warren Mercer ordered food for both of them with a relaxed confidence that communicated, without any deliberate effort, that he considered her company entirely appropriate. She told herself it was a professional lunch. She was almost entirely successful. Over the beef and the very good coffee, she asked about his history, not the ranch history which she was learning from the books, the personal history which she was learning to read between the numbers. He had come from Missouri in 1872, he told her. He was 20 years old. He had worked 3 years on a cattle outfit in Texas, learning the business from the base up, and then had come north to Wyoming Territory with enough savings and enough knowledge to file a homestead claim and start with 30 head of cattle and a tent. "Alone?" she asked. He was quiet a moment. "My father was supposed to come with me. He died on the road. Fever. I am sorry," she said. He looked at her as though gauging whether she meant it. He seemed to decide she did. "It was a hard year," he said, "starting from nothing in new country after something like that. But I had made a promise to him that I intended to keep." He paused. "He believed in the thing I was trying to do. That counts for something when you are out there by yourself." She understood that completely. She understood it in her bones. The way someone else's belief in you can function as a fuel when everything else is running out. She wanted to say that. She did not. She was keeping things professional. They were on horseback back to the Double M before the afternoon sun began to angle, and the ride was easy and mostly quiet, and she was aware, with an irritating and inconvenient precision, of exactly how far he was from her on the road. Close enough to talk without raising her voice. Far enough to be entirely proper. She was going to remain entirely professional. The business about the secrets in the ledger was about to become considerably more dangerous, and professionalism was not a luxury. It was a necessity. She found out how dangerous 4 days after her arrival, on a Wednesday evening when a rider came to the Double M with a message. Warren read it at the dinner table, and his face went very still in a way that she was learning to recognize as his equivalent of a strong visible reaction. He folded the paper carefully, said nothing. George Hatch cleared the dishes. The ranch hands who ate at the long table filtered out. Mamie stayed. She was waiting for the coffee to finish on the stove, and she was also, if she was honest, reluctant to leave a room where the air had just changed that specifically. "What is it?" she asked when they were alone. He handed her the letter. It was from Del Calhoun. The language was businesslike and almost friendly in its surface, but the meaning underneath was a clear and cold threat. He was aware, Calhoun wrote, that Mr. Mercer had recently engaged a new bookkeeper. He wished to advise that any investigation into past financial matters would prove not only fruitless but potentially damaging to the reputation and continued operation of the Double M Ranch. He was, as always, available to discuss mutually beneficial arrangements. The word trap came to Mamie's mind with crystalline clarity. "This is him warning you to stop looking," she said. Warren poured the coffee himself from the pot she had forgotten on the stove. "Yes. How did he know so quickly that I was looking?" He set a cup in front of her. "Someone on this ranch told him." They looked at each other across the table. "Luther," she said. "Or someone who told Luther. Or someone who is entirely separate and I have not identified them yet." This is the moment, Mamie thought, where most people in my position take a very large step back. She thought about the carpet bag. She thought about Laramie. She thought about the boarding house with the watery coffee and the narrowing view. Then she thought about the numbers on the pages and what they represented, and what it felt like to finally be doing something she was genuinely, powerfully good at. "I am not stopping," she said. He looked at her with an expression that had something in it she could not entirely name. "I was not going to ask you to. But you should know," she continued, "that if Calhoun is willing to send a letter this quickly, the information about me reached him within 48 hours of my arrival here, which means his contact on this ranch is active and confident. He may try other approaches." Warren set both hands flat on the table in the gesture of a man settling something internal. "I will make sure you are safe." She noted carefully that he said safe and not secure or protected, both of which would have been more generic. He said safe, which was a word with weight in it. She said, "The first thing we need to do is give whoever is watching us something to watch. Something that tells Calhoun we are going in a different direction than we are." He raised his eyebrows. "A misdirection. I want to start keeping 2 sets of notes. One that I leave visible on the desk, tracking a different line of inquiry. The supply costs for the horse feed account, which are legitimately high and which I can make look like a suspicious focus. And 1 set of real notes that I keep with me." He looked at her as though she had said something that required adjustment to his understanding of who she was. He did that every few days. She was beginning to notice. She said something or showed him something and he recalibrated. It was, she thought privately, the most interesting experience she had had in years. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" She needed him to behave normally around Luther Briggs. She needed him to let Calhoun's letter sit unanswered for now. She needed access to the deed records for the properties around the Double M, so she could map out what Calhoun actually owned versus what he was trying to acquire. Because understanding Calhoun's motive completely would help her understand which parts of the Double M's operation he most needed to destabilize. She also needed, she thought but did not say, for Warren Mercer to stop looking at her the way he had started looking at her in the last 2 days, because it was making concentration significantly harder, and she could not afford that. She told him the first 3 things. He agreed to all of them without hesitation. The next week was the most intellectually alive Mamie had felt since she was 8 years old reading Mrs. Forsyth's accounting guides by candlelight. She worked the books with a focus that was almost physical in its intensity. She traced the supply cost entries forward and backward. She mapped the timing of the false entries against the timing of Warren's cattle drives and found a pattern she had not expected, which was that the largest fraudulent withdrawals had been made during the weeks when Warren was away from the ranch on drives, when his attention was elsewhere, and his day-to-day oversight of the books was necessarily reduced. Harris had been smart about it, but not smart enough. Because no matter how clever the misdirection in the individual entries, the mathematics always told the truth if you asked it the right questions. Numbers could not lie the way people could. They could be arranged to deceive, but they could not be made to contradict themselves once you understood the full system. She found the final piece on a Thursday afternoon, 9 days after her arrival. Buried in the 1882 ledger, before Harris's false entries had begun, she found a set of original supply contracts that Harris had not destroyed because they predated his plan. Contracts that established the Double M's actual, legitimate supply costs in categories and amounts that directly contradicted the inflated figures of the 1883 false entries. It was the anchor she needed. With the 1882 legitimate baseline and the 1883 false entries and the Stokes receipts from the county records, she had a complete and documentable account of what had happened. The total amount taken from the Double M over 18 months of systematic fraud came to $940. Not a ruinous amount for a ranch of the Double M size, but entirely sufficient, Mamie now understood, to destabilize Warren's credit with the Laramie Bank if presented at the right moment and in the right way, which was what Calhoun had been planning. She was at the desk laying out the full documented account when Warren came in from the afternoon's work, and she looked up and said, "I have it all. Every entry, every amount, every date. With the original 1882 contracts as the baseline, it is airtight." He came around the desk and looked at what she had laid out, and the reading of it took him about 5 minutes, and in those 5 minutes the room was so quiet she could hear the evening wind picking up outside the south window. He straightened up. His expression was the controlled version of something enormous. "Mamie," he said. Nobody had ever said her name that way before. As though it meant something. "You would need to file this with the county sheriff," she said, because her voice was determined to stay professional even if the rest of her was not cooperating fully. "And probably the district court in Cheyenne. The sheriff here may have connections to Calhoun, so I would recommend going directly to the territorial level. I can write the summary document in legal language if you want. I read enough merchant law in Mrs. Forsythe's collection to draft something workable." He was still looking at her. "Warren," she said, slightly less steadily. "How did you do this?" he said. "How did you see all of this?" "Practice," she said, "and nobody ever told me I couldn't." He sat down on the edge of the desk, which was close, which put him at an angle that made the lamplight fall differently across his face, and she was extremely aware of the distance between them, which was significantly less than it usually was. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. Why did nobody ever hire you to do this before?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because nobody asked what I was good at." They looked at each other, and the full weight of that sentence sat between them, and then he said, quietly, "Their loss. My gain." Her heart did something entirely unprofessional. She looked back at the papers. She said, "We should talk about Luther." He accepted the redirect. He was a man who understood when something needed time. The investigation into Luther Briggs had produced a complicated picture. Of the 7 entries with his countersignature, 5 were ones that Mamie had concluded he had likely signed without scrutiny, because the false elements were subtle enough that a busy foreman reviewing paperwork would not have caught them. The other 2 were entries where the false figures were not subtle, and her conclusion was that he had known what he was signing. But when she laid this out to Warren that evening, his response surprised her. "If Luther knew," he said slowly, "then someone approached him." Luther is not the kind of man who would go looking for a scheme, which means someone went to him and offered him something, or threatened him with something, and he made a bad choice under pressure. Mamie considered this. It was the more generous interpretation, and she was not sure it was wrong. The world of small western towns was full of men who had made bad choices under pressure from more powerful people who had the resources to back up their threats or their promises. "He could tell us who approached him," she said, "if he is willing to. If he is not, then we have what we have in the documents and we proceed without his testimony." Warren stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the darkness and the distant lamp glow of the bunkhouse, and she watched him and thought about what it cost to be a man like this, who had built something from nothing and had it worked against from within by people he trusted. "I am going to talk to Luther," he said. "Tonight." She started to say something about being careful with how much he revealed, and he turned and said, "I know. I will let him talk first." He went. She stayed with the papers and the lamp and the quiet of the study, and tried not to imagine the conversation happening somewhere in the yard, tried not to let herself feel the fear that sat underneath her professional composure like a current of cold water, because if Calhoun became aware that she had completed the documentation and was preparing to go to the territorial court, the warning letter would not be the last thing he sent. Warren came back in 40 minutes. He sat down across from her. Luther knew, he said. She waited. Calhoun's man came to him in the spring of 1883. Luther has some debt in town, a loan he took for his sister's medical care back in Missouri. Calhoun's man told him that the debt had been quietly purchased and that if Luther cooperated with Harris in certain small ways, the debt would be forgiven. He was told it was just paperwork adjustments. He told himself it was not hurting the ranch significantly. He told himself a lot of things. He has been living with it since, and when I told him what I knew, he fell apart. Is he willing to testify? He is willing to do whatever is needed to make this right. His words. She absorbed this. It changed the evidentiary picture considerably. A cooperating witness who could testify to Calhoun's man approaching him was far stronger than documents alone. Then we have a case, she said. He looked at her. We have a case. The territorial court filing required a trip to Cheyenne, which was 2 days by train from Laramie, and Warren asked Mamie to come because she had drafted the summary document and understood the financial evidence better than anyone. She realized as they boarded the train in Laramie on a clear and bitterly cold November morning, being treated as a professional equal and a necessary partner, and the experience was so unfamiliar that she kept expecting it to dissolve. It did not dissolve. The territorial court clerk in Cheyenne received their filing with the gravity it deserved. The summary document Mamie had drafted was thorough and precise, and the clerk said, with visible appreciation, that this was the most clearly organized financial fraud complaint he had received in 3 years of managing such filings. Warren looked at Mamie when the clerk said this. She kept her eyes front. They stayed in Cheyenne 2 nights while the initial review was conducted. The hotel was respectable and separate, and she spent the evenings in her room writing up additional supporting documentation that the clerk had requested. But both evenings Warren came and knocked and asked if she wanted coffee sent up, and both evenings she said yes, and they sat in the small sitting room outside her room and talked. Not about the case, about other things. She told him about Kansas and Mrs. Forsyth and the books and the way she had felt reading them, the specific quality of being allowed to think hard about something without being interrupted or redirected toward more domestic concerns. He told her about the first Wyoming winter, 18 months after his father died, when he had been 21 years old and alone on 500 acres with 30 cattle and temperatures that dropped low enough to freeze the water in his boots, and how he had survived it by reading the same chapter of a surveying manual every night before sleep because the act of learning something kept his mind from the other things it wanted to think about. That is the same, she said. Exactly that. He looked at her. Yes, the connection between them was not invisible to either of them by this point. It had been building in the specific way that things build between 2 people who have been doing important, difficult work together in close quarters, and both of whom are intelligent enough to see it and honest enough not to entirely pretend it is not there. But neither of them said anything direct, because there were still live dangers, because the case was not concluded, because Mamie was still technically employed by him, and the line of propriety in such situations was one she was careful about. She was careful about it all the way back to Laramie. She was careful about it for the next 3 weeks while the territorial investigation proceeded, and the Double M continued its operations, and Warren managed the cattle, and the winter feeding, and Luther Briggs navigated the specific quiet purgatory of a man waiting to see the consequences of his choices. She was careful about it right up until the afternoon Del Calhoun himself arrived at the Double M. She was in the study with the afternoon's correspondence when she heard the hoofbeats and looked out the window to see a man she recognized from Warren's description, lean and neatly dressed, and riding a good horse with the particular ease of a man who has never had to be embarrassed by anything in public. He had 2 men with him. They waited in the yard. Warren came out of the barn to meet him. Mamie could not hear the conversation from the window, but she could read it, because she had spent her adult life reading rooms and situations the way she read numbers, which was to say carefully and without assumptions. Calhoun was talking. Warren was listening. Calhoun produced a document of some kind and held it out. Warren did not take it. Calhoun said more. Warren said something short. Calhoun put the document away and his posture shifted in a particular way, and the two men with him shifted too, and Mamie felt the danger of it move through her like ice water. She had the complete financial documentation in the desk drawer. Every original entry, every false figure, the 1882 baseline contracts, the Stokes receipts, Luther's signed statement. All of it in the drawer of the desk in the study. If Calhoun's men got into this room, none of the rest of it mattered. She moved without entirely deciding to. She pulled the documents out of the drawer. She rolled them carefully and tied them with twine. She lifted the floorboard she had identified 3 days after her arrival as the one that gave slightly under the edge of the braided rug, the one that had a gap of about 4 inches beneath it, enough space for a rolled document bundle. She had noted it then as a thing that could be useful and had not expected to need it this soon. She put the documents under the floorboard and smoothed the rug down and was back at the desk with the decoy notes in front of her when the front door opened and Warren came in. And behind him, uninvited but moving with the confidence of a man who has never been successfully refused, Del Calhoun. Mamie looked at Calhoun steadily, and Calhoun looked at her with the specific expression of a man who does not consider women to be meaningful obstacles. "You must be the bookkeeper," Calhoun said. "I am," Mamie said. He looked at the papers on the desk. "Those are your investigation notes. Those are the supply cost analysis for the horse feed account," she said. "Mr. Mercer asked me to review it for efficiency improvements." It was the misdirection she had prepared, the decoy inquiry. She had not known she would need to use it against Calhoun in person, but there it was on the page in her clearest handwriting, a thorough and plausible analysis of the horse feed costs that had nothing whatsoever to do with Harris or Stokes or the fraudulent entries. Calhoun looked at it for a moment. He was not stupid, but he was also not a bookkeeper. He could not read the document well enough to be certain it was not what she claimed. He looked at Warren. "I came to make a final offer," he said. "The territorial inquiry your office has filed is based on, let us say, unclear evidence. A missing bookkeeper who cannot be found to testify, and a document record that my attorneys will argue is incomplete. I am prepared to offer you a fair price for the creek frontage on the south section, a clean transaction that resolves any misunderstanding." Warren said, "I am not selling any part of the Double M to you." Calhoun let that sit. Then he said, "I hope your new bookkeeper appreciates the risks of her position here." It was a threat wrapped in civility, and it landed exactly as intended. Mamie felt it but did not let it show on her face. Warren stepped between Mamie and Calhoun. The movement was not aggressive. It was simply final. "We are done here," he said. Calhoun left. His men left with him. The yard was quiet. Warren turned to her. She was already on her feet. "He came inside," she said. "He looked at the desk. He saw the decoy notes." "Yes, and he could not tell they were decoy notes." She paused. "But he knows we filed with the territorial court. His mention of unclear evidence means he has already spoken to attorneys. He is going to fight this." She showed him the floorboard. He looked at the hidden documents, then at her. Then he said something that was not precisely what she expected. "Are you afraid?" he said. She thought about this honestly. "Yes," she said, "but I have been afraid before, and it has never made me stop doing the right thing." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You are the most remarkable person I have met in Wyoming." She looked at him. "That is a limited pool." He almost smiled. "It is not a limited judgment." She looked down at the desk. She looked back up. She said, "Warren." It was the first time she had used his given name without a formal address, and they both knew it. "Yes," he said. She wanted to say several things and selected with care the one that was true and also safe. "I will get you through this. I promise." He looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. "I know," he said. The territorial investigation moved through the winter months of 1884 with a slowness that tried Mamie's patience and an eventual thoroughness that justified it. The Cheyenne investigators followed the financial trail she had documented and confirmed every entry. They located Arnold Stokes, who, faced with the documented evidence, chose cooperation over prosecution and provided testimony that named Del Calhoun's agent directly. The agent, a man named Preston who had managed Calhoun's business dealings for 3 years, was arrested in January of 1885. Harris, the missing bookkeeper, was found in Colorado in February. He had spent much of the stolen money and had very little bargaining leverage. He testified fully against Calhoun. Del Calhoun was charged in the territorial court with fraud, conspiracy, and interference with the operations of a lawfully established business enterprise. The proceedings were handled in Cheyenne over the course of 3 weeks in March of 1885. Mamie testified. She stood in the territorial courtroom in the best dress she had, a dark blue wool she had purchased specifically for the occasion, and which she had spent 3 evenings altering to fit properly, and she explained the financial evidence to the court with the same clarity and precision she had brought to the ledger books in Warren's study. The prosecuting attorney had been initially doubtful about using a woman as the primary financial witness. He was not doubtful for long. She answered every question from every attorney on both sides with a precision that, she noticed, made the judge lean slightly forward at his bench in the way that judges lean when they are paying attention to something genuinely useful. Calhoun was convicted. The sentence was 5 years and a substantial financial penalty that included restitution to the Double M Ranch. Luther Briggs had testified as a cooperating witness. His debt to Calhoun's agent was officially canceled as part of the proceedings, and he received a suspended sentence in recognition of his full cooperation. Warren had not fired him. He had instead had a very long conversation with him that Mamie was not privy to, and whatever was said in that conversation seemed to have rebuilt something between the two men, not the same thing that had been there before, but something new and possibly more honest. Luther still watched Mamie with a complicated expression whenever he thought she was not looking. But the complication in it had shifted from resentment to something more like respect and a certain bewildered gratitude, because he understood, she thought, that she had been the one to identify his involvement, and had also been the one to tell Warren that the most likely explanation was coercion rather than greed, which had given Warren the framework for the conversation that had saved Luther's livelihood. The morning they came back from Cheyenne after the verdict, the spring had just begun, that particular Wyoming spring that arrives tentatively, and then with sudden conviction, the snow retreating up the mountains and the grass coming green in the lower pastures and the creek running high and clear. Warren stopped the buggy on the ridge above the Double M and they looked at it together, the ranch spread below them in the morning light, the cattle moving in the south pasture, the new fence line going in along the creek frontage that Calhoun had wanted so badly. "It is still yours," Mamie said. He looked at the ranch, then at her. Then he said, "I have been trying to find the right moment to say something for 4 months, and I have concluded that there is no right moment, so I am going to say it now." Her heart was entirely unhelpful. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as my bookkeeper. I want you to stay because this ranch feels different with you in it, and I feel different with you in it, and I have not felt this way about anyone since before I lost my father, and maybe not even then." He paused. "I know that you have been on your own for a long time and you have earned the right to go wherever you choose. I am not asking you to give anything up. I am asking if you would be willing to choose this, to choose me." He was 32 years old and he had built everything he had with his own hands out of raw territory and nothing else, and he was looking at her with the particular vulnerability of a man who has spent years being the one everyone else depends on, and has just made himself entirely dependent on the answer to a question. She looked at him. She thought about invisible. She thought about watery coffee and back rooms and the narrowing view. She thought about the first night in the study when he had brought her coffee and stayed without being asked. She thought about Cheyenne and the small sitting room and the surveying manual and the Kansas winter and Mrs. Forsythe's books. She thought about what it meant to finally be seen. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I have not wanted to go anywhere since I arrived." The smile that broke across his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him, and it made her chest ache with something that was not sadness. He took her hand. His grip was warm and certain, and she held it back. They stayed on the ridge for a while in the spring light, and the creek was loud below them, and the cattle moved through the new grass, and everything that had been in danger was safe, and everything that had been hidden was clear. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday in May. He did not do it dramatically, which was entirely characteristic of him. He came into the study after supper and set a small box on the desk beside her work papers and said, "I had this made in Laramie. It occurred to me that you should have been asked things properly." She opened the box. Inside was a ring of polished silver set with a small piece of Wyoming turquoise, the blue-green of creek water in October, the color of his eyes in the afternoon. She looked at the ring and then at him. He was standing with his hands at his sides, and his expression was direct and a little vulnerable and entirely sincere. She said yes. She said it clearly and without reservation, because there was nothing in her that had any reservation, and he put the ring on her hand and then held her hand for a moment, and the touch was gentle and absolute. They were married in June of 1885 in Laramie, at the small church on the main street that the Reverend Thompson had been building slowly for 3 years and had just finished. The ceremony was simple and real. Luther Briggs stood with Warren. George Hatch attended, having spent 3 days negotiating with himself about whether it was appropriate for the cook to attend the boss's wedding, before deciding that the question was absurd. The woman who ran the dry goods store in town, Mrs. Alderman, had become friendly with Mamie over the winter months, and she attended with her husband and her daughter. Mamie had written to her sister Clara in Kansas, the one sibling she had maintained any contact with through the years, and Clara had written back a letter so full of joy and astonishment that Mamie had read it 3 times, and each time felt something in her chest ease a little more. The wedding dress was the best thing she had ever owned. She had bought the fabric in Laramie, ivory muslin with a small floral print, and had sewn it herself over 6 weeks of evenings, and it fit exactly as she had intended it to, because she had measured everything 3 times before cutting, which was the same principle she applied to everything. Warren saw her come through the church door, and his face did the thing that it did, the recalibrating, the adjusting of his understanding of who she was, and she thought that if he kept doing that for the rest of their lives, she would never stop finding it remarkable. The Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony with a solemn warmth that felt exactly right. When he asked Warren if he took this woman, Warren said "I do" with the particular conviction of a man who has said "I do" to very few things in his life but means every one of them completely. When he asked Mamie, she looked at Warren and said "I do" and meant it all the way down. They went back to the double M as Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, which felt, the first time she heard it used of her, like a sentence she had not known she was waiting to be written. The summer was warm and full of work. The ranch recovered from the financial damage Calhoun's scheme had inflicted, partly because the restitution payment from Calhoun's conviction covered the majority of the missing funds, and partly because Mamie, now managing the double M's accounts with Warren's full authority, identified 3 additional areas where the ranch's operating costs could be reduced, and 2 where investment would significantly increase productivity. The first was the cattle feed. The second was the contract for selling the cattle to the Laramie market, which Mamie renegotiated personally with the buyer, and which, because she came to the table with 3 years of documented price data and a clear analysis of comparable sales from other ranches in the county, resulted in a rate increase of 12% per head. Warren watched her walk out of that negotiation with the signed contract and said, quietly, in the street outside the buyer's office, "I believe you could negotiate the terms of an act of God if you put your mind to it." She said, "I would need better documentation of the initial conditions." He laughed. Really laughed, with his whole face and chest, and it was one of the best sounds she had heard in her life. By the end of 1885, the Double M's books were the clearest they had been since the ranch's founding, and the combination of the restitution, the renegotiated contracts, and the operational efficiencies had put the ranch in the strongest financial position of its history. Warren commissioned a new study for Mamie. Larger than the original, with better light from 2 windows and a proper desk that had a full set of drawers and a surface large enough for 2 open ledger books at once. He had it built off the main house with the consultation of a carpenter from Laramie, and when it was finished it smelled of fresh wood and possibility. She cried when she saw it, which annoyed her considerably. He pretended not to notice, because he understood that she did not want it acknowledged, which was one of the many ways in which he understood her exactly right. Their son, James Gerald Mercer, was born in August of 1886. The Gerald was for Mamie's father, a choice she made with a complicated heart because her father had not been a good father but had been a man working under his own limitations, and she felt it was right to name something in the future after even a difficult part of the past. James was born at the Double M with a midwife from Laramie and Warren in the next room, which was where the midwife told him to stay, and which he did stay in, though Mamie could hear him pacing, the exact rhythm of his boots on the floor the metronome of his anxiety. When she heard him come into the room and saw his face looking at James for the first time, the controlled man who rarely showed everything showing everything, she thought this is what all of it was for. All the narrowing views and the watery coffee and the 40 miles and the carpetbag in the dust. All of it was the road to this room with this man looking at this child with that expression. James was a large, quiet baby with Warren's gray-green eyes and Mamie's tendency to observe everything carefully before responding, which made him remarkably easy to care for and also slightly uncanny, as though he were judging the competence of the adults around him. Luther Briggs, who had become over the course of the previous year something like genuinely reformed, took one look at James and said he had never seen a baby who looked more like he was managing a situation. Mamie found this funnier than she let on. The Double M grew. Warren added 50 head of cattle in 1887 and extended the creek frontage fence on the south section, the fence that Calhoun had wanted so badly. The water rights secured by that fence made the ranch significantly more valuable, and Warren and Mamie spent 2 evenings discussing whether to sell a portion of it at the increased value or maintain the full holding, and they decided together to maintain it. "We built this," Mamie said during that conversation, meaning more than the ranch, and Warren understood what she meant and said, "Yes, and it stays ours." She continued to manage the books and more than that. She became the person ranchers and smaller business owners in the surrounding area came to when they needed help with their own accounts or contracts or disputes. She did not charge what a lawyer would charge, but she charged a fair amount, and she was scrupulously honest about what was in her competence and what was beyond it, and the reputation she built was one of the most reliable reputations in the county. Warren had an addition built on the study so she could receive clients separately from the ranch's domestic space. He had a small brass plate made for the door that read M. Mercer, Accounts and Contracts. She stood in front of it on the morning it was installed and was quiet for a long moment. He stood beside her. She said, "Nobody ever told me this was possible." He said, "Nobody ever asked you the right question." She looked at him. He was 35 years old, and the Wyoming sun had put permanent lines at the corners of those creekwater eyes, and he was still the man who had stood on a porch and asked her what she was good at as though the answer genuinely mattered, and the answer had mattered, and the asking had changed everything. She took his hand. He held it the same way he always held it, warmly and with certainty, and they stood in front of that small brass plate in the morning light. Their second child, a girl they named Ruth after Mamie's mother, arrived in 1888. Ruth came into the world with opinions, loudly expressed, and showed no signs of revising this approach to life as she grew. James regarded her with the same assessing calm with which he regarded everything, and concluded within 2 weeks that she was interesting, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. Clara came from Kansas to visit that autumn, the sister Mamie had written to, and she stayed 6 weeks. She was a small, bright woman with Mamie's same tendency toward precision and a humor that had survived a hard life intact. She and Warren got along immediately, with the ease of two people who share a respect for the same person and recognize it in each other. One evening during Clara's visit, while Warren was doing the final checks of the evening and the children were asleep, Clara sat with Mamie at the kitchen table and said, "You know, I used to worry about you." "I know," Mamie said. "You never seemed to land anywhere. You were always doing things you were too good for and nobody was noticing. I know that too." Clara looked around the kitchen, the good lamp on the table, the solid house, the ranch beyond the window. She said, "How did this start? The real start?" Mamie said, "A man asked me what I was good at." Clara waited, and then he gave me work that proved it. Clara was quiet for a moment. "That is all. That is everything," Mamie said. Clara nodded slowly. "I think I understand." She left in October and Mamie wrote to her every month after that, and the letters were real letters, full of things worth saying, and Clara wrote back with the same. The winter of 1889 brought hard weather, and a challenge of a different kind when a new man, recently arrived from back east with money to spend, and ambitions that extended to acquiring established ranch properties, began making inquiries about the Double M. His name was Hammond, and he was more sophisticated than Calhoun had been, and his approach was not fraud but legitimate offer, a purchase price that was, on the surface, extremely generous. Warren and Mamie sat with the offer for 3 evenings. On the third evening, Mamie laid out a full analysis of what the offer actually represented versus the ranch's current trajectory. The offer was generous in dollar terms, but represented only 62% of the ranch's projected value at 5 years under current management and market trends. Additionally, Hammond's stated plans for the property would have eliminated the creek frontage rights that gave the Double M its most significant competitive advantage, and sold that access separately to a railroad interests group. In short, she said, "It looks generous and it is not." Warren looked at her analysis. He had never once in the 4 years of their marriage questioned her numbers. He asked questions sometimes to understand the reasoning, but he had learned precisely what her competence was worth. "I'm not interested in selling," he said. "Then we are not selling." She wrote the response to Hammond herself. It was courteous and entirely final. Hammond made one more approach in the spring and received a second response that was even more final, and he moved his attentions elsewhere. Luther Briggs retired from the Double M in 1890, at his own decision. He was 50 years old and he had a sister in Missouri who had been asking him to come home, and the years since the trial had given him back something he thought he had lost, a version of himself he could live with. He came to Warren and Mamie together, which she suspected was a deliberate choice, and told them he was going. Warren shook his hand for a long time. Mamie made him a meal, and he ate it at the kitchen table with James on one side of him, asking questions about cattle, which was James's current primary interest, and Ruth on the other side showing him a drawing she had done of a horse, which had 4 legs of significantly different lengths but an admirably expressive face. Luther looked at the drawing and said, "That horse has character, Ruth." Ruth said she knew. He left the next morning. Warren watched him ride out and his face did not change, but she could read what was in it, which was the complicated grief of a long-standing thing coming to a genuine end. She took his hand in the yard and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say and he did not need her words. He needed her presence. She had learned this about him, and he had learned correspondingly that she sometimes needed the words when he would naturally leave them unspoken. And they had made that adjustment between them over 4 years with no dramatic conversation about it, simply the daily practice of paying attention to each other. The 1890s brought Wyoming statehood, which arrived on July 10, 1890, and Mamie felt something particular about it. This territory becoming a state, this raw and working place being recognized as a real and settled thing. She thought about her father in Kansas, and his rented, exhausted land and the view that had narrowed progressively through her childhood. She thought about how far she had traveled, not in miles but in the more important sense. She was in her study the day the news came through, and Warren brought the Laramie newspaper in and set it on her desk, and she read the headline and put the paper down and said, "We made something real here." He sat across from her. "You made something real here. This county knows your name as a business resource in a way that would not have been possible without you doing the thing you do the way you do it." She said, "The double M gave me the place to do it." He said, "You gave the double M the reason to survive Calhoun. Those are equal things, Mamie." She accepted this because it was true, and she had learned, over the years, to accept true things even when they were about her. James was 4 years old in 1890, and by the time he was 6, he was following his father around the ranch with the specific focused attention of a child who has decided that everything being done is worth understanding completely. Warren answered every question with the same patience he brought to everything, and watching them together was one of Mamie's consistent sources of quiet joy. Ruth, at age 2, had already demonstrated a gift for numbers that made Mamie slightly weak with something between pride and recognition. By the time she was 4, she was counting cattle in the south pasture and reporting discrepancies in the count to whoever would listen, and the count was always right. "This is your fault," Warren told Mamie, with the warmth that always lived inside his dry delivery. "Everything useful in this family is my fault," she agreed. He kissed her. He did that with the same warmth and certainty that characterized everything he did, and 4 years into marriage it had not become routine. She did not think it would. Some things in life do not become routine. They deepen instead. A third child arrived in 1892. Another son, whom they named Thomas for no reason other than that it was the name that felt right when they said it aloud, holding the new baby between them in the quiet of the evening. Thomas was different from James in the way that siblings are always different, where the family structure that contained them was identical, but the person inside it was entirely their own. He was louder than James, more immediate, more prone to physical expression of everything, and he managed the 2-year gap between himself and Ruth with a cheerful aggression that Ruth managed in return with cool and superior competence. George Hatch, who had been the Double M's cook since before Mamie arrived, developed arthritis in his hands in 1893 and could no longer manage the full kitchen duties. He stayed on the ranch in a reduced capacity for 2 more years, advising the new cook Warren hired, and then retired to a small house in Laramie that Warren had helped him find and partially finance, which was the kind of thing Warren did quietly and without discussing it as a virtue. Mamie had by this point built her accounts and contracts practice into something that served clients in 3 counties. She had taken on an assistant, a young woman named Helen Bauer who was 19 and had come to Laramie from Colorado with a sound education and no connections, and who reminded Mamie in certain specific ways of herself at that age, specifically the quality of competence that had nowhere to go. She taught Helen everything she had learned about accounts and contracts and business records. She taught it the way Mrs. Forsythe had taught her, which was fully and without condescension, and with the underlying assumption that the student was capable of understanding everything the teacher knew. Within 2 years, Helen was managing a significant portion of the client work independently and had begun developing her own client base through her own reputation. Mamie watched this happen with the specific satisfaction of someone who has extended a chain. "You are building something that will outlast you," Warren said when she told him about Helen's first independent client win. "That is the intention," Mamie said. He was 36 that year and she was 31, and the life they had built was solid and warm and full of purpose, and they both knew it. They said so to each other, not often, but precisely when it mattered. One evening in the summer of 1893, they sat on the porch of the main house after the children were in bed, and the Wyoming night was very large and very clear, and the creek was audible below the south pasture, and Warren said, "I have been thinking about the question I asked you the first day." "What are you good at?" Mamie said. "Yes." He paused. "I did not know then how much the asking would matter. I asked because you were standing there with your bag and you had come 40 miles, and I was not going to let that go without asking the one useful question." He was quiet for a moment, "But I did not know it would turn into all of this." "All of this," she said. He gestured not at anything specific, at everything. "The ranch, the children, the study with the brass plate, you in my life, all of it." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and the night was very big and they were very small in the best possible way, the way you are small when you are part of something larger than yourself. She said, "I think about the road to this constantly. What would have happened if I had not come those 40 miles? If Luther had turned me away and I had simply gone back to Laramie? If you had not stepped out of that door?" He said, "I think the answer is that you would have found another way to this same place because you were always going to be this person. I just happened to be the door you walked through." She considered this. "I think that is more generous than accurate," she said. He said, "And I think you underestimate what you walked through a door carrying." She thought about the carpet bag, the thin dress, the watery coffee, all the jobs and all the back rooms and all the invisible years. "I carried everything I had ever learned," she said. "Yes," he said, "and all of it was worth carrying." They sat like that for a while longer, and the creek ran below the south pasture, and the cattle were settled for the night, and the study with the brass plate was dark and waiting for morning, and everything that had been in danger was safe, and everything that had been hidden was clear, and everything that had been unnamed had been given its right name. The spring of 1895 brought something Mamie had not expected. A letter arrived from the Territorial University in Laramie, which was in the process of establishing a Department of Business and Commerce, and was seeking practitioners with documented experience in financial administration and contract law to contribute to a lecture series being developed for the inaugural term. Her name had been put forward, the letter said, by 3 separate members of the business community in Laramie County, and by the county judge who had overseen several contract disputes in which her filings had been cited as models of clarity. She read the letter 3 times at her desk. Then she carried it to Warren in the barn where he was checking on the spring calves, and she stood in the barn doorway and held the letter out and said, "Read this." He read it. His face went through several things. The last thing it settled on was the widest smile she had seen from him since James was born. He said, "Obviously you are going." She said, "It would mean 2 days a week in Laramie during the lecture term." He said, "We have 3 children, a study with a brass plate, and George Hatch's replacement who runs an excellent kitchen. We will survive 2 days a week." She looked at him. She said, "You are not going to tell me it is complicated." He said, "Mamie, this letter is the county telling you what I have known since the 3rd day you were at my desk." He paused. "Besides, I would never be the person who tells you no to something true." She had known that. She had known it in every year of their marriage. He had never diminished her. He had never redirected her towards smaller things. He had done nothing but point at the direction she was already going and say, "Yes, that, go there, I will be here when you come back." She wrote back to the university the same afternoon. The lecture series began that autumn. She stood in front of 35 men and 4 women in a room at the university building in Laramie and delivered her first lecture on financial record-keeping and account management. And she was 40% through it before she stopped noticing that she was standing in front of people and started simply doing the thing she knew how to do, which was explain complicated things clearly. At the end of the term, 2 of the students came to her individually to ask if she was taking on any clerking or apprentice positions. She told them both to come and talk to Helen Bauer at the Double M office. Helen was delighted. James turned 10 in 1896 and began expressing a clear and decided interest in the law, which had started when he found one of Mamie's old contract filings in the study bookshelf and read it through twice and said at dinner that evening that he thought there were 3 places in the argument that could be improved. Warren looked at Mamie across the table. Mamie looked at James. "Show me," she said. He did. He was right about 2 of the 3. She taught him what she knew about legal language and contract structure in the evenings after Ruth and Thomas were in bed, and he absorbed it with the calm thoroughness that was his particular way of being in the world. She was privately certain that James Mercer was going to be the best lawyer in Wyoming before he was 30. She did not say this to him because she did not want to put weight on a 10-year-old, but she said it to Warren, and Warren said he thought she was probably right. Ruth at 8 had by this point demonstrated so clear an aptitude for mathematics that Mamie had begun teaching her out of the same books Mrs. Forsyth had lent her in Kansas. Not the children's versions, but the real accounting and merchant mathematics texts, and Ruth worked through them with the pleasure of someone who has found the thing they were made to do. Thomas at 6 was still most interested in the cattle, which was entirely fine. The double M needed someone to run it eventually, and Thomas had the instinct for it in his hands and his attention in a way that James and Ruth clearly did not. The 3 of them together, Mamie thought frequently, were the complete picture of what the double M was. Not just a cattle ranch, a place where things could grow into what they needed to be. 1900 arrived with the new century, and the double M was 28 years old, and Warren Mercer, who had started it with 30 cattle and a tent at the age of 20, was 50 years old and completely present in all of it. He had new gray in his hair, and the Wyoming years were more deeply written in his face, and he was still the man who asked the right question, still the man who held things with certainty and warmth, still the man who had sat across the desk from her on that first night and said, "Show me." On the morning of the new year, he came to the study early, before the children were up, and stood in the doorway. She was at her desk with the New Year's accounts already open, because she was always already at her desk. He said, "I want to tell you something." She looked up. He said, "This is the best thing I have ever made. Not the ranch, this." He paused, "all of it together. You and the children and this life. I want to make sure I say that clearly." She set down her pencil. She stood up. She crossed the study to where he stood in the doorway and put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him the way she had learned to look at numbers, which was without flinching, all the way to the truth at the center. She said, "You asked me one question and gave me everything." He said, "You answered it and gave me more." She kissed him. Right there in the doorway of the study, with the brass plate outside, and the south pasture beyond the window, and the new year open in front of them like a ledger with empty pages waiting to be filled. When she stepped back, his expression was the one she had seen on the first day and on the wedding day and the day James was born and every day in between that had mattered, the recalibrating, the adjusting, as though she was perpetually more than he had fully calculated. She loved him for it. She loved him for all of it, the question and the work and the certainty and the years. She went back to her desk. He went to the barn. The day began. The books of the double M showed, in the first years of the new century, a ranch that was entirely solvent and growing. The cattle operation was the most productive in the county per head. The creek frontage was still and forever theirs. The new study edition had been expanded twice. Helen Bauer, now in her late 20s, had established her own separate practice in Laramie and sent a client referral to Mamie every other month, because they had built something together that was larger than either of them alone. James went to read law in Cheyenne at 18. Ruth, at 14, was already helping Mamie with the accounts practice and had ideas about it that were better than Mamie's own ideas had been at 24. Thomas stayed on the double M, and by 16 was making cattle decisions that Warren discussed with him as he would discuss them with an equal, because Thomas's instinct for the stock was better than reliable. Warren and Mamie were 42 and 37 in 1904, And on a Saturday evening in August of that year, after a full day that had included a client consultation for Mamie, and a long inspection of the south fence line for Warren and a dinner that Thomas had helped George Hatch's replacement prepare as a birthday celebration for Ruth, they sat on the porch of the main house in the evening quiet. The ranch was around them in all directions. The creek was audible. The cattle were settled. The children were inside. She said, "Do you remember standing in the yard when I arrived?" He said, "I remember everything about it. You had that bag and you were about to leave, and I thought, there is something specific about this person, and I do not know what it is yet, but I am not letting it walk away without asking." She said, "I had already decided I was not going to cry." He said, "I am glad you stayed." She leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The Wyoming night was very big and very clear, and the stars, which in Wyoming are not metaphorical but simply real and close and numerous, were doing what they always did, which was being exactly what they were without any need to explain themselves. She thought about everything she was good at, the numbers and the letters and the contracts and the teaching and the building, and she thought about everything she had been given to prove it with, the desk and the ledger books and the brass plate and the children and this man and this life. Nobody had asked her. For 24 years nobody had asked. And then one man stood on a porch and asked, and she had answered, and the answer had been the beginning of everything real. She was still answering. She would go on answering for the rest of her life, in the books and the lectures and the letters to Clara and the lessons she gave Ruth and the practice she had built from nothing and the woman she had become, who was entirely, completely herself. The porch was warm. The night was clear. His arm was around her. Everything was exactly as it should be.